Can you hear me? Hello? Sorry, the mic is broken, so I'll have to stay here, I think. Not sure why it's not working. So, good afternoon to you. Just a quick announcement about the assessment. The midterm quiz will take place in week 8 at 9 o'clock sharp. It will be a kind of a home take quiz, if you wish, if you will, I should say. What happens is that the quiz will be on QM Plus, available to you at 9 o'clock, and will not be available, will stop being available at 10:30. So in that 90-minute window, you are expected to take the quiz, and quiz runs for about 60 minutes, 30 questions. So if you start at 9, you should finish it by 10. 10 o'clock sharp. If you start it at 9:15, so you'll finish it at 10:15. But if you start it at 10 o'clock, because the window is expiring in 30 minutes, you will only be able to have 30 minutes to attempt the quiz. So you will have 60 minutes within that 90-minute window to take the quiz at home or in the campus, wherever you are at that time, at that hour. So it's a bit of flexibility for you, and just to reiterate, as I've been telling to students who are emailing me, and also, yeah, you're confused. Okay, the midterm quiz. Midterm quiz. Also, one more time, it is the information about the midterm quiz. The dates and other things are not available on the module outline. Maybe that's why you're asking, but it will be in week 8. So now I know the date. It's and the day. It's Tuesday, 9 o'clock to 10:30. Between this time frame, you should actually attempt the quiz, or you miss it. You will not have any more chance or opportunity to take it. So please make sure you are available at 9 o'clock. If you are not available and you have extenuating circumstances to prove, show it to the admin officers in the SPM office. Go there and show them doctor's letter, appointment, or anything that you have. Yeah? And maybe another day will be scheduled for you. But that will be communicated to you in due course. Is this clear, guys? Do you have any questions? And by the way, quiz is very, very similar to, the questions are very, very similar to what you're doing in the weekly quizzes. So the weekly quizzes basically feed into the quiz, the actual quiz, yeah? Some questions may repeat, maybe replica of the questions will be there, but very, very similar basically, and not exactly the same. Some of them may repeat, as I said, but not exactly all. Majority are not exactly, but very, very similar. Some may some could be a replica. Now, answers, some of them, for some of them you will receive feedback, for some of them you may not. It's a failure by my side. I wanted to provide no feedback on these quizzes, apart from you coming to me and then asking the questions, then I would be providing you feedback. The aim was to make you read the book, to put it simply, to get the answers if you don't get it, right? To sit down and read the book, so that you are comfortable in there to do the final exam too. I mean, you rely on me to a lesser extent than on another course, let's say, if you were doing something else. So I wanted you to become more independent and create the knowledge yourself by following the lecture as a guide and then textbook as a notes, right? That's why I don't usually provide detailed notes as well. Economics is learned by practicing and by reading usually. Yeah? So practicing-wise, we do a problem set each week. So that's good enough for your final exam as well. In fact, some of the questions that we're going to do this week today and tomorrow, very, very, very again similar to the exam questions that you will see in January. So make sure you attempt them independently and also during the problem sessions or the seminars. Yeah. So any questions, email me. I'm available mostly during the week, but then definitely between 10 and 12 p.m. On Fridays. I haven't seen many of you right now or so far, but then I expect you to have a lot of questions, and please do come by on Friday, this Friday, and also ask questions. Your tutors are really good. They are quite experienced, so you can ask them questions as well. If you feel like you need more explanations than details, then visit me in my office. Now let's start today's topic, and today's topic is about market failure and how we, as economists, model the market failure or take into account market failures or correct the market failures, in other words, such that the optimal output or optimal outcome from these transactions, market transactions, are achieved. Now, this is China. In the last 20 years, one of the fastest growing economies, and actually in terms of GDP, total output, not GDP per capita, which is a different thing, yeah? GDP, total output. It is the second economy in the world after the USA. Now, there's some infographics here that I'm going to skip. This information is also available on your QM Plus page, but they are much more detailed than what you will see here. Maybe not this time, but previously, in the past 3 weeks, I provided greater details. But this week, I try to match what I'm presenting here to what's available for you on QM Plus. So enter that code to be able to track the process and also be able to attempt a pop quiz that follows. Now, this is a great achievement. It's a phenomenal achievement, actually. But then this is also China. And this is, by the way, the topic of today, so government intervention in the market. So until now, we've been telling that markets are free, price signals direct us, and we allocate the resources efficiently. This is also China, factories that support the economic well-being right now they are achieving. And this is also China. So this smog you can see in the cities are obviously outcome of what we need to achieve something, we usually sacrifice something else. Right, so this is exactly the case here, and these smokes that are coming out of these factories are not internalized usually, not paid for by these companies that are emitting these smokes. And they are now imposing externality on these bystanders. These are normal residents or the ordinary people, I could say, yeah? Now, what do the economists do about these things then? So far we looked at the private aspects of it, but then now we look at the socially optimal aspect of the market outcomes as well. So for today, in today's lecture, we'll cover Business Economics 3rd edition, chapter 7, in 7th edition, yeah? If you sorry, 3rd edition. If you have the 2nd edition, the old edition, that's chapter 6. Learning objectives are given to us, and we focus mostly on the externalities. There are plenty of market failures to look at, but we'll focus on externalities. Right, so free markets are driven by price signals. Prices enable us to allocate resources efficiently. Basically, in the market, supply and demand underlie the forces behind the efficient allocation of resources, yeah? And we expect the markets to allocate resources efficiently. Now, this is what you've studied so far, and at the equilibrium point, market resources in the market are efficiently allocated. So we have the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. So everyone is happy, in other words. Suppliers supply the goods that they can produce at given prices, and the quantity is demanded, so consumers demand at given prices. And now, here, we'll look at one thing here, the prices, allocating resources. Notice that the the arrows are pointing at one point. This is basically guided by price. Guided by price. For example, at 80 pounds, we have a surplus, yeah? Because at this point, that's the quantity demanded, but then at this point, quantity supplied. At 40 pounds, the price for a good, in this case, these are potatoes from the previous slides, you can see that we face a shortage because the supply is less than the demand, yeah? Supply is 200, but we would like to have 500,000 tons. as consumers. The difference is shortage. But as the shortage and surplus kind of interplay, in other words, the shortages lift the prices up because there's a shortage, producers increase the price to sell, and there's a surplus, producers tend to sell at lower prices to get rid of the extra stock. Eventually, the price can eventually lead us to the optimum point. That's privately optimum market quantity and market price here. That's the private aspect of it, yeah? Now, moving on. Another important aspect, by the way, the demand curve reflects all the value that we place on goods that we consume, yeah? So demand curve shows us the maximum price that a consumer, marginal consumer, is willing to pay, while the supply curve shows us along the supply curve, basically there are prices at which suppliers are willing to supply, which are the prices, or in other words, in economics we call them marginal costs, costs at which we are willing to supply if we were to manufacture goods, yeah? So keep that in mind, that's important. Now, but that process sounds excellent, or sounds interesting, and is a privately optimal point, but it turns out markets not usually, well, they may look like we are in an equilibrium by looking at the graphs and numbers. We could assume that we are in equilibrium, markets in equilibrium. However, they fail actually. Some signals may not necessarily guide us to the optimal point. Now, the optimal point I'm talking about now is the socially optimal point rather than privately optimal point. So originally, in that previous slide, we looked at the privately optimal point. Markets, you know, every one of us are driven by what do you call this, motivation. So prices are motivating us to buy or sell goods. But then there's also something else, social aspects of these activities. In terms of that, markets are actually failing when it comes to considering social aspects of the market. Now, market failure occurs when the free market doesn't allocate resources efficiently, in a way that not everyone benefits. Privately, we may benefit, but not society. Society doesn't capture that benefit. Look at Chinese example I gave you. It could be anywhere, but I picked up China because that smoke was evident. You know, it has been picked up by news agencies. Economic analysts were talking about it as an externality. So that was a good example for this purpose. Yeah, you can pick American cases as well. In the 70s and 80s, this was the case of America. The United States or Europe was producing. These were the gas guzzlers. So, in a market failure, competitive outcome is not efficient from the point of view of the society. Privately, they may be. Privately, they benefit the buyers and sellers, but in terms of society as a whole, is not a good outcome, apparently. And notice this cartoon here, this comic cartoon. Everything has been moved to Asia. Yeah, production moved to Asia. If you look at it, much of the real economy is in Asia right now, because that's what free markets do. Prices signaled, and producers follow the signal and move their production to other places where it's cheaper to produce, right? So that low cost is a price of the good, and now they're able to produce the low cost. So as a result, we have even Medicare being provided by in other parts of France. So if you look at some ideas here that the government sometimes thinks of is call centers for GPs. They could be located in India, for example. Yeah, you call from UK and say, I have a pain, and so they start asking you questions, and then they diagnose you. Instead of bringing Indian doctors, they could actually pay the Indian doctors in India and work through via phone, yeah, in a long distance, let's say, sort of treatment schemes. So for certain sections of society, this is not optimal case. If you look at it, this is not optimal case. So many of us are not comfortable with phone conversations, especially for diagnosing our sickness. Now, market failures can be originating from many sources, and there are some of this here, and we'll be looking at this only, existence of external costs and benefits in this lecture. So briefly about the rest. So there may be imperfect knowledge about buyers and sellers or of the product. Sometimes we buy things that we do not want only because it's shown in an advert. the advert showing it to us as if it's the best product, that we end up buying it although we don't want to buy it. So we're making this inefficient or not a good optimal decision. And goods aren't necessarily homogeneous as well. They are labeling, they are for branding, the packaging makes us buy this, although they aren't necessarily, let's say, in terms of agricultural products produced, for example. They aren't necessarily sweet, although the packaging shows that they are quite delicious products, right? So labeling makes us buy it. And it's clean product, but then it doesn't taste that much, yeah? So we're making this inefficient decision again. Resources are immobile as well. Sometimes, you know, we have unemployment that then unemployed people are not able to shift from one industry to another because they are quite immobile, they need to be retrained. So that inefficiency creates this imbalance in the economy, or equilibrium is distorted as a result. Or you have a market power concentrated on a few sellers or a single seller. Microsoft has been a kind of a monopoly for a long time in word processing software, and they were able to put any price they wish for a long time. Even today, I don't see anyone, many of you probably using vast majority using Microsoft Word instead of any other software to process your Word or PowerPoint slides, yeah? So for example, yeah? So instead of using, you know, instead of picking from a competitively provided goods, we just have to buy Microsoft Word these days to work with, yeah? Or lastly, here in this category, the markets do not supply the goods that are useful for the society, such as merit goods. Education is a merit good that benefits not only you, but the whole wider society. Imagine everyone is educated and everyone went to school and everyone is able to find a job. So these are not usually produced in good supply, and public goods are not usually produced because their private costs or private benefits are not as high as the social benefits. So it's the society that benefits more than the private if they if the private businesses provide this goods. Now looking at the existence of externality, look at this guy here. He's telling us that the company makes the inhalers to help with the asthma, but then background you see the factory that's emitting. So the benefit is that they are producing the good that's useful for asthmatic people or helpful or treats them, but they are imposing also externality by producing this good, which they don't actually take into account. They just emit the smoke and then that's it. It floats in the sky or in the air without being compensated for, and it imposes. So it creates this situation where asthmatic people will not be able to breathe properly. So now who benefits from it by selling the drugs or treatments for asthmatic people is again the company itself, right? So this is a case of negative externality of production. So now we look at externality. As I said, in this class we will only be looking at externalities. These are knock-on effects of a firm or individuals. I should say knock-on effects from production to bystanders, or the costs imposed by the private businesses on bystanders, to make it simply. Now, it could also be a benefit as well. So externality could be a positive externality or negative externality. Examples are given to you. Air pollution, for example, yeah, from factories or car exhausts. Do any of you basically pay tax for emitting that smoke, the fumes? You pay road tax, right? When you drive a car. What else do you pay in terms of tax that covers the emissions? Right now we expect it to be on taxed on the price of the car. The tax should have been included in the price of the car. So we need to, I'll have a look at that. If there is information about it, I'll upload it. But the car exhaust that you're emitting basically is not covered by you. You're just driving the car and that's captured or imposed on the bystanders who are walking or running in the street, yeah, by the pavement. Or health side effects, for example, of drugs or for example, if you are not vaccinated, obviously you are basically imposing a risk of infection on others, let's say, yeah? Or water pollution, that's another example. These are costly externalities. That's why they are negative externalities. Now, there could also be positive externalities, but we don't do as much of these. Research, for example. Much of the research has been done on technology in the past. Today, we are benefiting from it, yeah? Some people are benefiting, some firms are benefiting. A lot of firms are just copying from other firms. How to make the mobile phones, computers. That's why you have new brands. In the past, computers were manufactured by HP, Dell, Apple, and who else? A couple of others, if anything. Today, you have so many names that you don't recognize even them. Yeah, quite competitive today. You have Huawei now producing computers. You have Mi producing Redmi mobile phones. So these names are new because they are able to capitalize on the research has been conducted in the past. They came up with, they built on this previous research, and today they're doing even more research. That means in the next couple of decades, this research then benefits others. Yeah? So that's a positive externality, but these firms are not paying for that. Or the immunization. If you're immunized, you are less likely to pass the disease or to get the disease, to catch the disease, and then to pass it to someone else. Yeah? If you're immunized, you are actually imposing positive externality on a friend of yours who is with you. Since you are not sick because you are immunized or you're protected from the person next to you, even if they are not immunized, and they are not sick as well because they are not going to be catching the disease from you. So you are basically as a kind of antivirus for them as well, even if they are not immunized. And education, for example. Future benefits are higher wages, and intangible benefits are that less crime. If educated people are less likely to go and commit crimes, or argue and stab and deal this societal antisocial behavior, right? Commit antisocial behavioral crimes, for example. Now, usually when production takes place, firms only take into account private costs. They ignore the costs that are imposed on society, the externalities, for example, to the third parties. Now, as a result, social costs are greater than the private costs. And now, social costs are the sum of private costs and then the cost of externality, or its negative externalities, or positive externality in this case. There could be social benefit as well, right? But we now concentrate on social costs to explain you, and move on to benefits of or positive externality as we progress. Let me just quickly. Okay. At the time. Now, market failure broadly results in inefficiency. That could be a productive inefficiency. Productive inefficiency happens when the firms are not producing at the lowest possible cost. They are paying higher than they could have paid if they were aware of the externalities, positive or negative externalities, right? But since they are ignoring the externalities, they end up producing at a higher cost. Productive efficiency is often, this is a broader case. It's not necessarily the case of emissions or environmental damage. In this case, we're looking at monopoly, for example. Yeah, this distorts the productive efficiency and creates productive inefficiency when there's a monopoly or many other market failures. Now, allocative efficiency results in when we buy what we actually do not want, let's say, yeah? We buy things making uninformed decisions, for example, goods that are we think useful, but they may turn out to be not that useful. Now, because of economic inefficiencies, and notice this, inefficiencies are not necessarily things that we can tangibly see, we can see physically. Yeah? They are concepts that if we use or apply in economics, we get better outcomes than what we have today, right? So economic inefficiencies lead to welfare losses as a result. Now, how do we then measure the welfare losses? Because we've been talking about these losses, things like conceptual or theoretical aspects of the topic, but then we haven't actually managed to look at how we measure the welfare losses, or deadweight losses, in other words. So let's look at welfare economics a little bit. This is an important concept and will be in the quiz. From now on, few bits will be in the quiz. Assume you want to buy a laptop for your university work, so for coursework or taking notes, and usually you will have a budget that would enable you to afford the price. So you have a price in mind that you want to pay, you are willing to pay, which is you have a demand, you have a place on the demand curve for a laptop, let's say. But there's also a price that you are not prepared to pay at all. Yeah. Now, you come to a store and you say, I want to buy a laptop, and you won't tell you what budget you have. You look at the price. The price is lower than what you want to pay. Price is lower than what you want to pay. So the difference between price that you want to pay and then what you are going to pay is your benefit. Your welfare is increased by that amount. So you keep that saving. It could be a saving, but in economics, let's measure it, call it a benefit of this transaction. Look at this example here. You have £10,000 in mind for this car, but the seller is offering it for 10,000. That's the deal, right? So you have 3,000 benefit in this case. You're willing to pay that much. So this is called your surplus. You are a consumer. That's consumer surplus. Now, that's the definition in simple words. Here it is described mathematically. Look at this. P1 is the price what you pay and quantity what you get at that price. But anything above this price and below the demand curve within this triangle is called consumer surplus. Think of it this way. You set out to buy a PlayStation for boys, for example, and you are willing to pay 400, so let's say 500 pounds. Right here is the 500 pounds. So you are right here. You're buying the next PS4 at this price. This is the next quantity. But then when you went to a market and saw the prices, they are actually P1. They are 300 pounds. So the difference between the price you want to pay and the price you pay is your surplus. And this is the same for the next marginal customer, and then so on and so forth. As the next customer wants to pay lower price, and they go out to purchase it, and then they see a different price, and the difference between these two prices, then they are consumer surplus. When we add each of your consumer surplus, we end up having a section here, a triangle called consumer surplus area. So the whole area is called consumer surplus. It's the basically difference, positive difference between what you want to pay and what the price is actually in reality. Yeah? Now, this is true. This can be applied. This concept can be applied to the supply curve analysis as well, or supply of goods as well. So along the supply curve, prices are reflected. These are the costs or costs of production, marginal costs of production in this case. So this section here, or let's say this whole supply curve, reflects the prices at which producers are willing to sell. So this quantity, for this quantity, the price is this much, let's say, this much, but in the market price is higher. So the difference between what consumers pay or what they sell, the producers sell at, and then what they are willing to sell at is their surplus now. So difference between what they get and the price they are willing to sell the goods. Right? Does that make sense, guys? Yeah? Price, market price minus the price on the supply curve is basically producer surplus. Because the P1, let's say, is the equilibrium price. So this whole area now represents the sum of every producers that is in the market surplus. Yeah? Every producer surplus, all producers surplus. Now, in an equilibrium case, or when we sum the producer surplus and consumer surplus, we get the total surplus from in this market. Notice that the shaded area, the green area, greenish area, is the consumer surplus, as the difference between basically the market equilibrium price and the price consumers are willing to pay based on the demand curve. The price is on the demand curve. Now, the pinkish area is the producer surplus, or the benefit that producers get by selling at the market price, not at the price they are willing, basically. Yeah? So it's the difference between the market price and then the price they are willing actually to sell at these products. Yeah? So this triangle represents the producer surplus, this triangle represents the consumer surplus. Some of them is called total surplus. Now, the welfare loss is then the reduction, or this another name for it is actually dead weight loss. Dead weight loss is the reduction in the total surplus. Now, how do we usually achieve this reduction or end up having this reduction? It's usually either by taxes imposed by the government upon the consumers and producers. It just distorts the market competitive outcome, or some policy restriction on, for example, production of goods that basically keeps the prices at higher point than what they, or lower point than what they could be otherwise in a competitive market. So either policy or taxes basically distort the total, if I move back, total surplus, and we end up having less welfare achieved from competitive outcome. Yeah. So here's an example that hopefully you'll understand. This is important. This modeling of the deadweight loss or welfare loss is important for the next what slides comes next. So the learning is cumulative in this case. So pay attention to this. Let's assume that the market for this good is at equilibrium. So right now we have 100 units of this item and at 15 pounds, the price without tax. So if you look at it, the consumer surplus at this equilibrium point or equilibrium output or outcome, I should say, is the sum of A, B, C areas. So the areas, these three areas make up the consumer surplus. These are above the equilibrium market price but below the demand curve. Now producer surplus are then D, F, E. The areas D, F, E represent the producer surplus because this is basically covering, these are covering the areas below the equilibrium price but above the demand curve here, right? Now, that's the maximum surplus that can be achieved in the absence of taxes. Let's assume that the government imposes a tax, and tax is, let's say, 8 pounds. 8 pound tax here on this good. What happens is that there's a common sort of understanding among ordinary people that when there's a tax on a good, it's usually passed on to the consumers. Not necessarily. It really depends on demand curve. If the demand curve is inelastic or demand is inelastic, yes, all of the tax is passed on to consumers, so prices go up by the amount of taxes. But in competitive markets, not all taxes are paid by consumers only. There is a share of tax paid by producers as well. So this is the case, because demand here in this case, as you can see, is relatively elastic. So some of the tax is paid by now or borne by producer here. Now, if there is a tax, remember what happens on a product. The shift, there's usually a supply shift to the right. So I've not drawn the supply shift here, but the supply curve would have shifted to this point. So supply would have moved to this parallelly to the left side, yeah? But ignore that for now, because for the purpose of explaining this distortion, we don't need that shift. But assume there's a shift. And as a result, new equilibrium is this point here. And the price went up to 20 from 15. Notice that. Tax is actually 8 pounds, but the price only increased by 5 pounds. That's because 3 pounds is captured, of that tax is captured by the producer. So producer now receives 12 pounds per unit sold. Buyer pays 20 pounds. And the producer, now the consumer surplus is now only A, this area. This area is only the consumer surplus that's enjoyed by the producers, consumers, yeah? So A is the only area that consumers capture. Now, producer surplus is also declined. F is the area only now for the producers to capture, because that's they receive 12 pounds. Now, this area here, B and D, this whole area is 8 pounds times 80 units. Basically, this area is the tax revenue that's going to the government. The third party is in the transaction now, is intervening, the transaction between two parties. So 8 pounds of that 8 pound tax is actually creating that huge amount of revenue. Now, C and E is not captured by anyone now because no one is using it or benefiting from it, basically. Yeah? So producer surplus is this area, F. Government's revenue is this area, B and D. If you sum them, that will make up the government revenue from tax. And A is just a consumer surplus, sorry. Now, as you can see, that tax actually reduces the consumer surplus by B and C, while B is captured, C is not. The producer surplus is then reduced by D and E. Only D is captured by government, E is not. And this area is called, C and E is called deadweight loss or welfare loss. So this area is not captured by anyone because this distortion, taxation, created the welfare loss or minimized our, there's no way of capturing, in other words, of this. If we go by the theoretical aspect of this. The only way we can capture is by getting rid of taxes. Because of taxes exist, prices are higher, and we buy less than what we would have bought in the absence of taxes, right? So C and D is basically deadweight loss in this case. Now, this is how we, basically, if you're good at calculus or indices geometry, you could simply times this distance, that's 20 units, and this distance, which is, what is this here, 5, and then divide by 2 gives us this surface area of this triangle, and sum this with this E, add them together, so that gives us the welfare loss in terms of monetary units, yeah, in terms of monetary, so the pound units, yeah. But for now, that's an exercise for you to tinker with, but that would give us, so this is how we measure the welfare loss, in other words. So that was the question we asked earlier. How do we measure welfare loss? So yeah, if I go back, just to keep you in the loop. So can we measure the welfare loss? Yes, we can. That's a theoretical aspect of measuring it. But in practice, measuring welfare loss is not that easy. Yeah, it's not easy. So that's what, if you're good economists at some point, when you do PhD in economics, you may come up with a new idea of measuring welfare loss than what's already available to us. Then you may get the next Nobel Prize. By the way, yesterday we had the announcement of Nobel Prize for the economists. 3 great economists received it. So take a look at the news. Now, let's look at the analysis of externalities and how the externalities impose socially suboptimal outcome. Assume this now, that in the absence of externalities, there is no, and assuming that there is no imperfection, no taxation, nothing, nor nothing is taken into account, in other words, by the private buyers and sellers, then what you have is that the market equilibrium Q market at an equilibrium price of P. So that's missing, but we have supply curve in that case representing only private costs of production. So private cost of production is only the cost of production, physical production. Yeah? It's just money cost. So at each price, we have a supply units here given, and prices, supply curve here represents the marginal cost or the cost of production. Now, demand curve represents how much we value the products and how much we are willing to pay as a result. Yeah. So demand curve reflects the prices that we are willing to pay. So this reflects only the private value to us, to consumers. Now, moving on now. This is the case of aluminium production. And this market here, just look at the blue lines for the time being, represents the private equilibrium in the aluminium market. So price of aluminium is reflected on the y-axis, quantities of aluminium demanded and produced are on the x-axis. Ignore the rest, look at the blue line for now. The 2 blue lines are the demand and supply. Right now are reflecting price values for suppliers and buyers. Now, however, remember, aluminium production comes with externality. The toxic fumes from the factory usually distort the or affect the environment. It might bring about cancerous diseases as well in the society living or the population living close to these factories. That's why aluminium production takes place far away from the residential areas. But in the end, what happens at the end of the day, these fumes don't just simply disappear into the thin air. They actually stay in the atmosphere, and they come down in terms of in acid rain, for example. When it rains, the fumes, they come down usually. The rain brings it down. It's a light kind of gas that then can be brought down by water, for example. Yeah. So this then distorts, for example, distorts the soil quality as well, because acid raining means all this green environment will disappear, and it affects the people living nearby. It's like really, it's like an atomic bomb destroying whole thing. It's radiation kind of thing, yeah. But it's a small amount, of course, compared to very, very small amount compared to atomic radiation, right? So moving on. So blue curves here represents the private costs and private benefits, yeah. Demand curve shows us the private value. Now, if we were to take into account the externality cost, the externality that's coming from this aluminium production, then we should have been producing along this supply curve, yeah, along this supply curve instead of this supply curve. So the supplier should actually be producing along this curve. So this vertical distance here is just measuring the cost of pollution per unit. Yeah, you can measure the pollution in tons. So 1 ton of pollution or CO2 emission could be measured these days. So we can basically impose sort of, we consider that, and we add this to the private value. So basically then this social cost will then be private cost plus this external cost of pollution, right? Then this curve reflects the cost of producing the aluminum in terms of social costs. So along the supply curve now we have the social cost rather than just the private cost, because this supply curve now reflects the external cost as well, added to the private cost. So this is a social cost curve as a result, or supply curve that takes into account the external cost as well. Now, what's the outcome then? Outcome is that we should actually produce less of aluminium in order to be able to take into account the external costs apparently. So the optimum is actually Q optimum here, not Q market. Q market tells us produce more because there is demand. But then when we consider the costs, we should actually produce less. So there's a reduction. So there's a movement backwards to optimum, here. So so arrow should be pointing to the, in this case, to your left, to the optimum point. So right now we're producing here, but optimum should be this, if we were to consider the external costs, right? Now, because we are producing at this point, we have this area called the welfare loss area. We're just imposing it on the others. That area should be internalized or reduced if we were to produce at the optimum point at a higher price. Yeah? So that's the analysis of externalities, negative externalities. Now, moving on. I thought at this point maybe we'll look at a good example from Library Square in this campus. Last week, if you remember, there were a few barbecue days. Now, if you passed by, you would smell the smell of that, smoke of that. And this is actually a negative externality imposed by the by this producer or supplier. Let's call this barbecue guys. They are just not paying for that smoke, right? Especially if you are sitting in the lecture hall in France's Bancroft building. It's likely that you felt the smell as well. So that actually caused the externality or the external cost. And these BBQ guys are not paying for that, right? So if they were to pay for it, they should be producing less than what they produced at the time. So this is an example of an externality imposed on the students by the BBQ producers there, yeah? Because no one is charging them for smoke, and no one is actually charging them for producing. I think they are not actually even paying anything to be there, because I think we had this period usually where the young entrepreneurs are able to showcase their produce and sell and benefit, sell to students and benefit from being here basically. Right, so moving on now, positive externalities. There are some activities that actually yield benefits that are not captured, and that are, these activities are provided in short supply. As you can see, again, I forgot to color this in black. The book has it in blue. Sorry, I forgot to color this in blue, I should say. So this black supply curve and then the blue demand is the original quantities, equilibrium quantities, and showing us the equilibrium point, I should say. Now, this activity, whatever this activity is, produces a positive externality. That means if we were to take into account that positive externality, in this case it's the vertical distance here that's giving us the value of that. If we were to add that positive externality to the private value of it, then we should have a social value or social demand curve. So that's represented by the red line here. Yeah? So the new red line demand curve represents the social value that's including positive externality and or the external benefit and then private value. In other words, we should be buying more of it. We should consume more of it. For example, you can think of this as education. We should be educating more people because it has more positive externality. Every single woman educated, every single the girl we educated here is actually going to be educating the whole nation. Men may not be educating the whole nation. It's a bit of a joke because every single woman here or the girl will have a at least a couple of kids, they will be educated as well as a result. So that's a positive externality of educating girls or society as a whole. Men, of course, do their best as well, but they're usually less likely to be sitting with the boys and their children to educate them. Yeah. So it's the woman who spends more time with their kids. So educated women create educated children. These educated children then create more educated. So there's benefit of that overall. So we should be educating more students, right? So quantity optimum is higher usually than the market outcome as a result. Right now, we all thinking of our private costs and private values. We should think of it slightly differently. The externality should have been taken into account as well, so that this college should expand to accommodate more students, and more students should think of paying for education, yeah, so on and so forth. Of course, education is not the only resort or the last resort usually for success. You can be an entrepreneur and so on. So by not providing more at the optimum quantity, and by producing or by basically sticking to the market equilibrium, we are basically not internalizing this amount here, whatever here. It's the welfare loss, basically. We are not capturing that area. So if you were to move there, as you can see, both producer and consumer surplus will increase by that amount. So it's split it by 2, for example, yeah, that this will be a new equilibrium point. So that and that area would be captured by the society as a result. So moving on now. Just a quick question, guys. Could you take out your mobile phones or your laptops, and 20 seconds here. So we've been talking about this definition of that, so what do you think? Many of you have no mobile phone or nothing, and some of you just have no. So do please bring them. I don't know. Okay, that's interesting. So we'll include some problem set questions on dead weight loss for next week. As I can see, there's quite a few of you guys not knowing that, although we're covering it right now. So pay attention to it, and maybe I'm speaking too fast or not clear. Then feel free to come and see me in my office hour, guys. Not that. I assume, although many of you understood from among the students what the concept is, but many of you might have had the knowledge from before, the understanding of the concept, right? So about 77% of who are voting understood what the topic is. So it's the loss of total consumer and producer surplus, guys. It's the loss of this whole area, biggest surplus, yeah? So you may be just choosing this answer by selecting this answer by reading the total and not reading the sentence to its end. So make sure that you read it completely before you select an answer. And this should be the case for your quiz as well. Make sure you read. So I'm going to close the quiz. I'm going to move on. I can see the vast majority do understand it. That's a good news. But we still have other students telling us that they don't know. That's French. Now we still have time. Don't move. Don't move. We still have 3-4 minutes. So how do we then take into account or account for the externalities? One way is to regulate the markets or restrict the production of something, or provide some sort of create environments for this such that producers of these goods are producing more or supplying more, right? So that's regulation-wise. But we can also alternatively create incentives or market-based policies that incentivize the production and consumption of these goods. These include taxes. We call them Pigotian taxes. Yeah, Pigotian. Arthur Pigot is a French, if I remember correctly, French economist. Came up with Pigotian taxes and subsidies. He talked about, or he proposed taxing the companies that are emitting or creating negative externalities, and providing subsidies to companies that are producing less of goods that have positive externality. Yeah. So this is something that we are supposed to continue with. We expect to continue, but as you can see, we don't have much time, so we still have a few minutes. Now, internalizing. So these taxes and subsidies help us internalize. In other words, when we internalize them, we consider the benefits and costs. So using taxation and subsidy, we are able to internalize the costs and benefits. In other words, when we use tax, what we do is we tax the producer of aluminium, for example, for emitting. And these tax revenues are then used to clean the air, for example, or used to treat the people affected by the production. So tax and subsidies are the two instruments to internalize the externalities. Subsidies are then, for example, paid to buy or to produce more of electric cars, for example. Yeah? Some years ago, electric cars were in short supply. Then government announced a subsidy for companies who want to produce electric cars. Dyson, last week, decided not to produce electric cars, but it appears they received, I think, 5 million pounds in subsidy from government for their research and development. So this sort of subsidies usually, because electric cars create positive externality or reduce the negative externality, right? So there is no emission. So that negative externality is reduced, and positive externality is that they are much more efficient, fuel efficient, so we don't have to, what you call this, pay for this gasoline or the petroleum. Now, taxes usually are enacted to correct the effects of negative externalities, and I talked about Pigovian case, yeah? And subsidies are defined right here. Now, I'm going to skip this. There's one graph that shows us how externalities are considered or taken into account. Look at this. This is about 2 minutes long or 1 minute long explanation. Now, remember, if we were to take into account the negative externality, we should be taxing. Yeah? We should be taxing the producer. Now, if for this producer a tax is imposed, let's say a 50p tax is imposed, the original equivalent price was £3, but now €3, now it's 3.30, because with that extra tax, the distance here is the tax amount, 50p, the supply curve shifts backwards, and then the deadweight loss that we had before is now taken into account or is internalized. So 50p is the external cost per bottle, in this case, yeah, of whatever the production is, right? So that is being, that's being taken into account or internalized. The external cost is internalized by taxing, so by the amount of external cost. Anyway, there are a couple of slides left, but take a look at them, and please be on time for your seminar activity today and in your right slot. No, don't go to the other slots.